Pi-hole in a container, 61 megabytes. The same Pi-hole in a virtual machine, 759. Same service, same machine, same afternoon. That's 12 times the memory for identical functionality, and most Proxmox tutorials will still tell you to spin up the VM. So when should you actually use one? That's what this video answers. And there's one scenario where using a container will genuinely get you into trouble. We'll get there. Here's the actual difference, and it's simpler than most explanations make it sound. A virtual machine runs its own full operating system, its own kernel, its own init system, everything. From the hardware's perspective, it's a separate computer. The hypervisor just tricks it into thinking it owns the hardware. That isolation is powerful, but it costs memory before your application does anything at all. That's the whole reason the VM in the intro cost 3/4 of a gigabyte. Almost none of that was Pi-hole. It was Debian, being a computer. An LXC container doesn't have its own kernel. It runs on the host's kernel directly, using Linux namespaces and C groups to stay isolated. No kernel to load, no second init system, no emulated hardware. Just your application, slightly fenced off. That's where the 61 megabytes comes from. It isn't a trick or a measurement error, there's simply nothing else in there. The trade-off, and there always is one, is that the fence is shorter. Both processes share the host kernel. If the host kernel has a vulnerability, LXC containers are closer to it than a full virtual machine would be. We'll come back to exactly when that matters. Let's make this concrete. Density follows from that. 16 gigs on my host, and Proxmox wants a couple, so 14 to hand out. A VN idles at 3/4 of a gig, but you still hand it a whole one. So 12 to 14 before the host starts hurting. The container version costs 60 megabytes, so RAM stops being the thing you run out of long before you hit a limit. I'm doing arithmetic here, not a benchmark. Real services aren't all Pi-hole, and you'll hit CPU or disk first. But the shape is right, and it's the shape that matters. Boot time. LXC containers are up in 1 to 2 seconds. A virtual machine boots a full kernel, so you're waiting 15 to 30 seconds minimum. If you're spinning things up and down frequently, that adds up. Performance, both are excellent. LXC runs at 99 to 100% of bare metal on CPU. Virtual machines with KVM hardware-assisted virtualization, which is what Proxmox uses, run at 97 to 99%. The difference is basically unmeasurable for most homelab workloads. Neither of them is slow. This is not a performance argument. The argument is RAM and density. And on a cheap mini PC, that is the argument that matters. So when do you use LXC? Case 1. Linux-only services you trust. Pi-hole, Home Assistant, Vault Warden, Jellyfin, Getir, Uptime Kummer. Nextcloud. These are the bread and butter of self-hosting. They're all Linux, they're all well-maintained open source, and they all work perfectly as LXC containers. The Proxmox community scripts, the ones that started life as the T-Tech scripts, deploy almost all of them as LXC by default. And there's a reason for that. Case 2. High density unlimited RAM. If you're on a cheap mini PC, which is most first home labs, LXC is how you run a dozen services without the machine sweating. Virtual machines for everything is how you run 3 and constantly hit memory pressure. Case 3. Intel I, GPU transcoding. If you're running Jellyfin or Plex and you want hardware transcoding via Intel QuickSync, which every N100 and N305 mini PC supports, you can pass the I, GPU into an LXC container and it works. You add 2 lines to the container config map/dev/dre/render D128 and you're transcoding with near zero CPU overhead. This is actually the recommended approach for Intel hardware. Case 4. Fast iteration. Snapshots in LXC are instant. If you're testing a new service, want a snapshot before a config change, and roll back in 2 seconds if it breaks, LXC handles this better than virtual machines. Not because virtual machines can't snapshot, but because at LXC's size, it's nearly free. Now, the cases where you reach for a virtual machine. Case 1. Windows. LXC is Linux containers only. If you need Windows, a game server, a Windows-only application, testing, it's a virtual machine, no discussion. Proxmox runs Windows virtual machines extremely well with the VirtIO drivers installed. Case 2. NVIDIA GPU pass-through. If you're passing an NVIDIA GPU for AI inference, gaming, or transcoding, do it in a virtual machine. NVIDIA in LXC is technically possible but fragile and poorly documented. The community consensus in 2026 is NVIDIA goes in a virtual machine, Intel I GPU goes in an LXC. Don't fight this. Case 3. Workloads you don't trust. If you're running something with unknown code, an experimental service, or anything where you genuinely want the strongest isolation barrier, use a virtual machine. The kernel separation matters here. An LXC is isolated, but not as isolated as a virtual machine. For a Pi-hole or a vault warden from a reputable project, LXC isolation is fine. For something you found on GitHub 2 hours ago and don't fully understand, virtual machine. Case 4. Different kernel requirements. LXC shares the host kernel. If a service requires kernel features your Proxmox host doesn't have, or if you need to test on a specific older kernel, virtual machine. In practice, this is rare for homelab workloads, but it exists. And a note on Docker in LXC. You'll see this debated constantly. Running Docker inside an LXC container works. You need nesting equals 1 enabled on the container. It's slightly less isolated than Docker inside a virtual machine, but for a home lab running trusted images, it's a perfectly reasonable trade-off. Most people in the community do it. Just don't run it as a privileged container unless you understand what privilege means. Root inside a privileged LXC is root on the host. And one thing that's actually new. Proxmox 9.1 added native OCI image support. You can pull an image straight from Docker Hub and Proxmox converts it into an LXC container. No Docker, no virtual machine, no nesting flag. Which sounds like it ends this entire debate. It doesn't yet. It's a tech preview, and right now there's no in-place update. When a new image tag drops, you destroy the container and recreate it. So for anything I actually care about, I'm still running Docker in an LXC with nesting enabled. But it's worth knowing it exists, and it's a whole video on its own. I'll cover it properly. Let me show this with an actual service. Pi-hole, the DNS level ad blocker. I'll install it both ways and we'll look at the resource usage. First, as an LXC, I'm using the community script. Open the Proxmox shell, paste one command, hit enter, accept the defaults. 30 seconds. Containers up, let's check the summary tab. 61 megabytes of RAM, CPU at essentially 0. That's Pi-hole running, serving DNS with the web interface up. Give it a few weeks of real traffic and it settles higher. I've got one that's been up 25 days sitting at 159. Either way, we're talking megabytes. Now, the same thing as a virtual machine. I'll spin up a minimal Debian virtual machine and install Pi-hole manually. The virtual machine is up. Let's check its summary. 759 megabytes. And that's a minimal Debian install with nothing else on it. You'll notice the summary says 617. That's the guest's own view, page cache filling the gigabyte we gave it. 759 is what the host actually pays. Same service, same box, same afternoon. That's 12 times the memory to do exactly the same job. On a 16 gig machine, that's the difference between running many services or just a few. The math scales with everything you add. Here's the rule, one sentence. If it's Linux and you trust it, use LXC. If it needs Windows, Nvidia, or you genuinely don't trust it, use a virtual machine. That covers 90% of homelab decisions. The Proxmox community scripts deploy as LXC for a reason. Use them. Save your virtual machines for Windows, for Nvidia, and for things you want properly walled off. The last thing I'll say, LXC is not a compromise. It's not VM Lite. For a homelab running Linux services, it is the correct tool. The tutorials that tell you to use virtual machines for everything are writing for people who have enterprise hardware with hundreds of gigs of RAM. You probably don't. Use the tool that fits the machine you have. If this helped you figure out what to actually spin up next, the next video covers setting Proxmox up from scratch. The post-install steps nobody shows you. Links up there. See you in the next one.